The late afternoon sun hung low over the frontier town, casting long shadows across the dust-choked street. The air was heavy with heat, tobacco smoke, and the sound of coarse laughter. Folks had gathered outside the saloon, where a makeshift platform had been erected. It wasn't unusual for cattle, tools, or even horses to be auctioned off in such a manner, but today the crowd buzzed with something darker. Today, a human life was up for sale. At the center of it all stood a girl, no more than 17. Her dress was torn at the seams, the once pale fabric now stained with dirt and travel. She kept her head down, refusing to meet the greedy stares of the men around her. The town's auctioneer, a sharp-eyed man with a grin too wide to be trusted, yanked her forward by the arm, ignoring the way she flinched. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice slick with false charm. "We've got ourselves a runaway. Barely grown, but strong enough to work, pretty enough for company. Who'll start the bidding?" A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Coins jingled in pockets, boots scraped against the wooden boards, and the girl's stomach twisted. She'd run from cruelty, from a life where her spirit was worth less than the dirt underfoot, only to find herself here, displayed like an animal for trade. Someone shouted, $2! The crowd roared with laughter, treating the bidding like a game. Another man raised it to 3, then another to 4. The auctioneer fanned the fire, his words mocking. "Come on now, fellas. She's worth at least a meal at the saloon." The girl's cheeks burned with shame, but she refused to cry. She bit the inside of her lip until the taste of copper filled her mouth. If she cried, they'd only laugh harder. Then came the final bid. A voice from the back, calm and low, said, "5." The crowd turned, expecting some drunk or fool, but what they saw quieted their laughter. A tall man leaned against the hitching post, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. He was dressed plain, dusty boots, worn trousers, a faded shirt, but there was something about the stillness of him that commanded attention. He didn't smirk like the others or leer at the girl. His expression was unreadable, carved from silence itself. The auctioneer blinked, clearly disappointed. $5, is that all?" He glanced at the crowd, but no one else spoke. The humor had drained from the moment as if the man's presence had stolen it away. With a scowl, the auctioneer slammed his palm down on the platform. "Sold! For $5. The girl's knees nearly buckled. $5. That was all her life amounted to in the eyes of the town. She'd prayed for freedom, but this felt like another kind of prison. She risked a glance at the man who had bought her, trying to read his intent. His face gave nothing away. The cowboy stepped forward, his spurs whispering against the dirt. He handed over a few crumpled bills without ceremony, then looked at the girl. Not a look of hunger, nor pity, nor cruelty, just a steady, quiet gaze that unsettled her. He tipped his hat, motioning for her to follow. The crowd muttered among themselves, disappointed there'd been no real fight for her, no scandal worth gossiping about. As the cowboy led her away, someone called out, "Don't break her too! Fast! Stranger!" The laughter returned, loud and cruel, but the cowboy didn't respond. His silence was louder than their jeers. The girl followed, her heart pounding. She had no choice. $5 had bought her fate. Yet something in the man's calm stride, in the way he ignored the crowd, sparked the smallest ember of curiosity. He hadn't touched her roughly. He hadn't looked at her the way the others had. He'd simply claimed her, without words, without gloating. Still, fear gnawed at her belly. She had escaped one cage only to walk into another. The question haunted her steps as the town faded behind them. Who was this silent cowboy, and what would $5 buy him? The girl trailed. Behind the cowboy, her thin shoes scuffing against the dirt as they left the noisy street behind. The saloon doors swung once, twice, before falling silent, and with them, the sound of laughter faded into the heavy quiet of the open road. Each step away from the town felt surreal. She hadn't imagined surviving the auction, not really. She had half expected one of the cruel-faced men to drag her off the stage, to yank her hair or bind her wrists. Instead, she walked free, unbound, though her heart still hammered with dread. The man who had bought her said nothing. He strode with the steady, measured pace of someone who had walked this land his whole life. Dust clung to his boots and the hem of his coat, but nothing about him seemed careless. Even his silence had weight, like he chose each moment to withhold words. When they reached a weathered horse tied at the edge of town, the cowboy finally moved with purpose. His horse was a big bay gelding, broad-shouldered and patient, shifting, only slightly as they approached. The girl froze a few paces back. She had never ridden far, not since she'd fled her home. Her legs were weak, and fear gripped her chest. The cowboy looked at her then, really looked. His eyes were a muted gray, steady as stone. He studied her for a long moment, but there was no cruelty in his gaze, no ownership. If anything, there was consideration. She couldn't decide if that unsettled her more than the leers of the others. Without speaking, he untied a small canteen from his saddle and held it out. She hesitated, clutching her ragged dress, but thirst won over fear. The water was warm, from the sun, yet it tasted like salvation. She drank in quick, greedy gulps before realizing he was watching. Embarrassed, she stopped, thrusting the canteen back. He gave a short nod, as if to say she owed no apology. Then he mounted the horse in one fluid motion and extended a hand down to her. Her stomach dropped. If she took it, she would be at his mercy. Yet what choice did she have? She remembered. The jeering crowd, the coins tossed like scraps. Better to face the unknown than return to that. Tentatively, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but not rough, steadying her as he pulled her up behind him. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but the cowboy gave a low murmur that calmed the animal instantly. She clung to the back of his coat, stiff as a board, every nerve alert to the closeness. Yet he made no move to take advantage. His focus was fixed on the horizon. They rode in silence, the rhythm of hooves drumming against the packed earth. Fields of golden grass stretched wide on either side, swaying in the wind. With the town shrinking in the distance, the girl's panic dulled to a sharp ache. She dared a whisper. Why did you buy me?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he hadn't heard her, or if he simply chose not to speak. Then, finally, his voice came low and even. $5 is a cheap price to keep men like them from you." She blinked, startled. The words carried no pride, no boast, just plain fact. She wanted to press him further, to ask what he meant, but his silence returned like a wall. Perhaps he wasn't a man of many words. Perhaps she would never know his reasons. Still, something in her chest loosened, a fraction of the tight fear she had carried since stepping onto that auction block. The horse crested a hill, and she saw. The land spread before them, rolling plains, a river cutting silver through the green, and mountains rising faint in the distance. It was wide, endless, and nothing like the cages of her past. She swallowed hard. The cowboy guided the horse down the trail without another word, his shoulders broad and unyielding before her. She didn't trust him. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, she dared to wonder if she hadn't been purchased as property, but rescued as a human being. The horse's steady gait carried them farther from the town until the last echo of voices and the faint clatter of wagons disappeared into the wind. All that remained was the wide frontier. Open plains stretching in every direction, the sky so vast it seemed to swallow them whole. The girl clung to the back of the cowboy's coat, her hands stiff, knuckles white against the coarse fabric. Each mile that passed only deepened the unease in her chest. She had escaped one prison, but what if she had stepped into another? The cowboy had bought her. $5 had changed hands, plain as day. Whether he had done so out of kindness, necessity, or some hidden motive she could not yet tell. Her mind turned in circles. Would he expect her to cook for him? Clean, or worse? Would he claim the rights of a man who thought money could purchase a body and a soul? The thought made bile rise in her throat. The cowboy gave no clue. He rode in silence, guiding his horse with steady confidence. Every now and then, he would adjust the reins, shift in the saddle, or murmur a word low in his throat that the animal seemed to understand. Beyond that, he offered nothing. No conversation, no glance over his shoulder, no explanation of where they were going. His silence weighed on her, pressing heavier than the heat of the sun. The trail wound toward a cluster of cottonwoods by a narrow creek. The cowboy slowed the horse, letting it drink from the cool water. He dismounted with an "Easy, Grace," then turned to her. His hand extended upward once more, an invitation for her to climb down. For a moment she froze. If she touched the ground, she would no longer be in motion. She would be here, wherever here was, and at his mercy. Still, her legs ached from riding, and thirst clawed at her throat. With careful hesitation, she let him steady her down. His hand was rough from years of work, but not unkind. Without a word, he filled a tin cup from the creek and held it out. She accepted, sipping cautiously this time, watching him all the while. He knelt beside the horse, checking its hooves, giving her space. That struck her as strange. If he had bought her, shouldn't he be closer? Shouldn't he demand? Instead, he acted as if she were not a possession at all. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, meeting her eyes for a brief, piercing moment. "Away," he answered simply, then returned to tending the horse. The single word echoed in her mind. Away, from the town, from the men who had laughed and jeered, from the shackles of her past. But away could mean anything. Away to safety, or away to another kind of danger. They rested briefly in the shade, then continued. The trail narrowed, winding through scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. She studied the man in front of her, searching for clues. His back was broad, his shoulders squared, but there was a stillness about him that made her think of deep waters, quiet on the surface, but powerful beneath. Hours later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of rose and amber, her fears returned. What did he plan for her once they stopped for the night? Would he reveal his intentions then? She thought of running, but where could she go? The plains stretched endlessly, and she had no food, no horse, no sense of direction. Survival alone was impossible. Her thoughts raced so wildly that she didn't realize they had stopped until he swung down from the saddle. He gathered wood, struck flint, and built a small fire with practiced efficiency. The glow lit his face, in sharp relief, angular, weathered, and unreadable. When the fire was steady, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He handed it to her first, before taking one for himself. She blinked, surprised. If she were truly nothing more than property, he would have eaten first. Instead, he saw to her needs before his own. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft night sounds of crickets. Slowly, the tight knot of dread in her chest began to loosen. Perhaps he was not what she feared. Perhaps, just perhaps, this road was not leading to another cage, but to something else entirely. Still, as the stars bloomed overhead and the fire warmed her weary bones, she made herself a promise. She would remain cautious. Trust was a luxury she had learned the hard way not to give freely. But for tonight she was safe. Safe in the presence of a man who had bought her freedom for $5, yet demanded nothing in return. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across the rough ground. The girl sat wrapped in the cowboy's coat, its weight heavy but warm across her shoulders. She had resisted when he first offered it, unsure if accepting meant giving him some unspoken claim over her. But the night air had turned sharp, and her teeth had begun to chatter. He had simply draped it around her without asking, as though it was nothing more than common sense. That simple act unsettled her more than threats would have. She knew how to defend herself against men who were cruel or demanding. She did not know how to guard against kindness. The cowboy sat across from her, cross-legged, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of metal on stone was steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. He didn't watch her while he worked, didn't speak unless necessary, but somehow his silence was not hostile. It was disciplined. Finally, she couldn't hold back her questions any longer. "What do you expect from me?" she asked, her voice low, brittle with tension. "You bought me. People don't spend money for nothing." The knife stopped mid-stroke. He lifted his eyes, gray and unflinching, and held her gaze. For a long moment, she feared she had angered him. Then he spoke, his voice low but even. "I don't expect anything. You eat, you rest, you heal. That's all?" She blinked, confused. "That's all? You don't want me to—" She cut herself short, the words bitter on her tongue. "No," he interrupted, the single word firm enough to leave no room for doubt. Her hands tightened on the coat. She wanted to believe him, but trust was not a thing she gave easily. Still, something about the calm certainty in his tone, the way he never shifted his eyes away or filled the silence with nervous words, made her think he was telling the truth. Set the knife aside, folded his arms over his knees, and leaned slightly toward the fire. "You're not property," he added quietly. "Not mine. Not anyone's." The words hit her harder than she expected. Not property. The town had treated her as little more than cattle, worth only $5. Even before that, in the home she'd fled, she had been little more than a burden to be ordered about, beaten when she resisted. Yet this man, the silent cowboy, looked at her as if she belonged to no one but herself. Still, she had to be sure. "Then why?" she asked. "Why spend the money? Why not just walk away?" He stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. For a while, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his voice came, low and steady. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch them strip the last of your dignity." Her throat tightened. No one had ever spoken of her dignity before. It had always been obedience they wanted, silence, usefulness, but never dignity. She turned her face away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. The cowboy didn't press her. He didn't ask for her story or demand thanks. He simply rose, checked the horse tethered nearby, then returned to his spot across the fire. His knife glinted faintly in the firelight as he resumed sharpening it, each stroke a steady reminder of his presence. She studied him, searching for cracks in his composure. He was a hard man, yes, his shoulders broad, his jaw sharp, his face weathered by sun and wind. But there was no cruelty there, only restraint. He seemed like a man bound by rules no one else could see, a code written deep inside him. As the night deepened, exhaustion pulled at her bones. She lay down, the coat tucked around her, and watched the fire fade into embers. Sleep came slowly, wary and restless. But each time fear surged, she remembered his words. "You're not property." The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was the cowboy, still awake, sitting guard by the fire with his knife laid across his lap, silent, watchful, unyielding. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she closed her eyes without bracing for the blow of a cruel hand. Morning broke with a pale light spilling across the plains, turning the sky a soft wash of pink and gold. The girl woke slowly, the cowboy's coat still wrapped around her like a shield. For a moment, she almost forgot where she was. The crackle of the dying fire, the smell of smoke and leather, the steady presence of the cowboy sitting nearby. It all came rushing back. He was already awake, of course. He sat on a flat rock, whittling a piece of wood with the same patience he seemed to bring to everything. His horse grazed in the grass beyond, calm and unhurried. It was a picture of quiet order, and for the girl, it felt foreign. Her own life had never been quiet. She sat up, hugging the coat closer, uncertain if she should speak. The silence between them stretched, as it often did, but this time it seemed to invite her instead of shutting her out. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask again why he had saved her, why he treated her like she was more than what the world said she was worth. But another question pressed harder, the one she hadn't dared to voice until now. Would he still think her worth saving, if he knew what she had run from? The words spilled out before she could stop them. I didn't leave home because I wanted adventure. I left because I had to. The cowboy paused in his carving but didn't look up, letting her go on. That small gesture, his quiet, patient listening, loosened something in her chest. My stepfather. Her voice faltered, catching on the memory. He said I owed him for food, for a roof, for existing at all. Every day it was chores until my hands bled. And when that wasn't enough, he used his fists. My mama tried to stop him once. He broke her nose and said she'd have worse if she got in the way again. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. The memories were jagged pieces of glass inside her, cutting anew as she spoke them aloud. I thought if I ran, maybe he'd let me go. But he didn't. He sent men after me, said I was worth something, even if it was only for labor, or... Her voice trailed off, thick with shame. The cowboy finally looked up. His jaw was tight, his gray eyes hard as stone, but not at her. No, the anger in his gaze was directed elsewhere, toward the shadow of the man she spoke of. She swallowed, pressing on. That's how I ended up at that auction. They caught me. Dragged me into town, laughed when the bidding started. She gave a bitter laugh of her own, hollow and sharp. $5. That's all I'm worth. Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite name. The cowboy set aside the wood and knife, leaning forward slightly. Don't say that again, he said, his voice quiet but edged with steel. She blinked, startled. What? $5 bought you out of their hands. That's all it was. What you're worth. That ain't something men at an auction can decide. Her throat tightened painfully. No one had ever spoken like that to her, not her mother, not anyone. Tears stung her eyes, and this time she didn't fight them. They slipped free, tracing down her cheeks as she bowed her head. The cowboy didn't move closer, didn't try to touch her or soothe her like some men might. Instead, he gave her space, his silence strong enough to hold her grief without judgment. In that silence, she found more comfort than words could have offered. When she finally looked up, her vision blurred. He was still there, still steady, still unyielding. "Why do you care?" she whispered, her voice raw. He held her gaze a long moment before answering. Because no one should be made to forget they're human. The fire inside her, long buried under fear and shame, flickered faintly at his words. She wasn't sure yet what that meant for her, but she knew this. She wasn't alone with her. Shadows anymore. Someone had seen them, and instead of turning away, he had stayed. And that small, quiet truth felt like the beginning of something she had thought long lost, hope. The days began to fall into a rhythm. Morning rides beneath wide skies, evenings by the fire, nights wrapped in silence, broken only by the rustle of grass or the distant call of coyotes. At first, the girl lived each hour braced for disappointment, for the moment when the cowboy would reveal himself to be no different from the men she'd fled. But the moment never came. Instead, she found small surprises in the way he lived. He rose with the dawn, his movements measured and precise, never rushed. He tended his horse with the same care he offered her, always feeding the animal first, brushing down its coat, checking its hooves before worrying about himself. He seemed to abide by a code she couldn't quite name, a discipline that governed his every action. At first she kept her distance, speaking only when necessary. But silence stretched long on the open plains, and little by little words began to fill it. She asked about the land, about which plants were safe to eat and which weren't. He answered simply, never wasting more words than needed, but always answering. When she asked about the stars one night, he pointed out constellations, his finger, tracing arcs across the dark sky. Sometimes she caught herself smiling. The sound startled her, as if laughter were a language she had forgotten. He noticed too. One evening, after she managed to coax a small fire to life without his help, she let out a triumphant laugh. His lips twitched, just barely, as though a smile threatened but refused to fully form. She stared at him, stunned. She hadn't imagined he could smile at all. In return, she began to give back what little she could. She cooked when they had more than dried meat, stewing wild onions and roots he showed her how to gather. She patched a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread she'd carried, hidden deep in her bundle of things. The first time she handed it back to him, she held her breath, expecting some harsh remark about her uneven stitches. Instead, he simply nodded, wore the shirt the next day, and that was thanks enough. Trust didn't come all at once. There were nights when she woke gasping from dreams of her stepfather's fists, certain she'd hear his voice in the dark. The pena. Cowboy never asked what the dreams were about, never pressed her. He would stoke the fire a little brighter, offer her water, and keep watch until she drifted back to sleep. His presence was enough to anchor her. One afternoon, he stopped the horse by a shallow stream and handed her the reins. "You try," he said, voice quiet but firm. Her eyes widened. I've never. "You will now," with his steady. Hand on hers, she guided the horse down to the water, learning the pressure and release of the reins, the way her posture shifted the animal's response. At first, she was clumsy, tugging too hard or too slow. But he was patient. When she grew frustrated, he didn't scold. He simply said, "Again." By the time the sun dipped low, she had managed to ride a short distance on her own. Pride swelled. In her chest, small but fierce like a flame sheltered from the wind. That night by the fire, she whispered, "Thank you." He didn't ask what for. He didn't need to. He only gave that small nod of his again, as if to say, "You don't owe me gratitude for what you should have always had." As the days passed, she realized she no longer felt like a prisoner walking beside him. She didn't feel owned. She felt seen. Each quiet act, the coat around her shoulders, the lessons he offered, the way he always kept a respectful distance, stitched back together pieces of her that had long been torn. The bond between them wasn't forged by grand declarations or sweeping gestures. It was built in the quiet spaces between one heartbeat and the next, in the silent understanding that dignity wasn't given, it was recognized. And in the presence of this silent cowboy, she was beginning for the first time to recognize it in herself. The weeks of quiet living had lulled the girl into something dangerously close to peace. She woke to birdsong instead of shouting, worked with her hands without fear of punishment, and learned to ride with growing confidence. Each day stitched new strength into her bones. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. It began with a sound, distant hooves carried on the wind. The girl froze where she knelt by the stream, filling a tin cup with water. Her heartbeat quickened, her mind flashing to the nights she'd lain awake in fear of being found. The cowboy lifted his head, already alert. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver, his body still but coiled like a drawn bow. He didn't speak, but his eyes met hers across the stream. That single look told her what she already knew. Trouble was near. The rider appeared first as a speck on the horizon, growing, clearer as he drew closer. The girl's stomach turned cold. The horse was sleek and fast, carrying a man who sat tall in the saddle. Even at a distance, she recognized the type: confident, practiced, dangerous. A bounty hunter. Her hands trembled, spilling water into the dirt. She scrambled back to the cowboy's side, her voice tight with panic. "It's him. They've sent someone." The cowboy gave no reply, no false promise of safety. He only watched as the rider approached, his gray eyes narrowed. When the man drew up before them, dust swirling around his horse's legs, he tipped his hat with a smirk. "Afternoon. Mighty fine day for riding." His voice was smooth, too. Smooth, carrying the smugness of someone who believed he already had the upper hand. The girl shrank back, her breath catching in her throat. The cowboy didn't move. The bounty hunter's eyes slid to her, lingering with a greedy spark. "Well, now," he drawled, "you must be the runaway I've heard about. Caused quite a stir, you did. Your stepdaddy says you've got debts to pay, and he's willing to pay me handsomely for your return." Her chest tightened, as though a noose had been thrown around her neck. The past she had fought so hard to escape was here again, threatening to drag her back. The cowboy's voice cut through the air, low and even. "She ain't going with you," the bounty hunter barked a laugh. "That so? And who are you to say? I don't see a badge on you, friend. Last I checked, $5 don't make her yours." "She's not property," the cowboy said, each word steady as iron. The laughter faded from the bounty hunter's face. He leaned forward in the saddle, his tone sharper. "Then you're standing in the way of my business, and men who get in the way of my business don't last long." The girl's breath came fast and shallow. She could almost feel the trap, closing in, the same helplessness from the auction flooding back. But when she looked at the cowboy, she saw no fear, no hesitation. His hand rested near his gun, calm as ever, his whole frame radiating unspoken resolve. For a tense moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Wind stirred the grass. The horse shifted beneath the bounty hunter. The girl pressed her fists against her knees, her pulse hammering. Finally, the bounty hunter sneered. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't save you. I'll be back. And when I am, no amount of silence or stubbornness will keep her from where she belongs." He jerked the reins, turning his horse in a spray of dust, and rode off into the distance. The girl watched until he was a dark blot fading into the horizon, her whole body trembling. Only then did she realize the cowboy had never moved, never wavered. He remained steady as a mountain, his presence a shield between her and the danger that threatened. When she finally found her voice, it cracked with fear. "He'll come back. He won't stop." The cowboy's gaze followed the disappearing rider, his jaw tight. Then he looked at her, his gray eyes steady. "Let him try." The words weren't loud, weren't boastful, but they carried the weight of an oath. For the first time, she believed she wasn't facing the shadows of her past alone. The bounty hunter's warning had hung over them for days, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The girl felt it in every quiet moment. The way her eyes darted at shadows, the way her breath caught when distant hoofbeats carried on the wind. She tried to focus on the rhythm she and the cowboy had built together, riding, cooking, tending to the horse. But the threat lingered, sharp as a thorn under the skin. The cowboy, however, gave no sign of fear. His habits didn't change. He still rose before dawn, still sharpened his knife with steady strokes, still moved with the calmness of a man who refused to let the world dictate his pace. If anything, his stillness became more pronounced, his silence deeper. It was as though he was waiting, patient, unshaken, for the storm he knew would come, and come it did. It was near sundown, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and violet, when the sound of horses split the air. Not one this time, but three. The girl's blood turned to ice. She scrambled to the cowboy's side, her voice a whisper laced with panic. It's him. He brought others. The cowboy's gray eyes flicked toward the horizon. Three riders approached, dust rising behind them. The bounty hunter led the way, his smirk visible even at a distance. They dismounted a few yards away, boots striking hard earth as they fanned out. The bounty hunter tipped his hat mockingly. Told you I'd be back. You had your chance to walk away. Now you're gonna regret standing in the way of business. The girl's hands shook as she clutched the cowboy's coat tighter around her shoulders. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to disappear into the tall grass, but her legs wouldn't move. Fear rooted her in place. The cowboy stepped forward, placing himself squarely between her and the bounty hunters. His stance was calm, deliberate, shoulders squared, hat brim low, hands relaxed at his sides. He didn't reach for his revolver yet, but the air shifted, taut with the certainty that he would if needed. The bounty hunter sneered. You really think you can take on three of us? For what? $5 and a runaway girl who ain't worth the trouble? The cowboy's silence was answer enough. One of the hired men chuckled darkly and spat in the dirt. Reckon we ought to teach this one a lesson. His hand twitched toward his holster. In a heartbeat, the cowboy moved. His revolver cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion, and the barrel gleamed in the fading light. He didn't fire. He didn't have to. His stillness, his aim, his unyielding presence spoke louder than any bullet. The air went heavy, charged, with the kind of silence that made men hesitate. The two hired guns exchanged uncertain glances. The bounty hunter's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected resistance this steady, this unshakable. You don't scare me, he growled. Though, his tone lacked the same easy arrogance as before. The cowboy finally spoke, his words quiet but sharp as steel. Walk away. The command cut through the dusk like a blade. For a long moment, no one moved. The girl's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. She watched the man who had bought her freedom for $5 stand tall against three, armed riders, and in that silence she realized something. He wasn't just fighting for her survival. He was fighting for her dignity, for her right to live without chains. The bounty hunter's jaw tightened. He weighed his chances, saw the unwavering steadiness in the cowboy's gray eyes, and spat into the dirt. Ain't worth the bullets. He jerked his reins sharply, mounting his horse. The others followed, muttering curses under their breath. Within moments, the three riders disappeared into the falling night, their silhouettes swallowed by the horizon. The girl's knees nearly buckled with relief. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, struggling to draw breath. The cowboy holstered his revolver, calm as if nothing had happened, then turned to her. His gaze held no pride, no gloating, only quiet assurance. They won't trouble you again, he said simply. She stared at him, words tangled in her throat. Gratitude, awe, and something deeper churned within her, but all she managed was a whisper. Why do you keep risking yourself for me? His eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. Because no one should have to fight the world alone. In that moment, she believed him. The silent cowboy hadn't just stood against guns and greed. He had stood against the weight of her past, the shadow of every man who had tried to strip her worth away, and with nothing but silence and steel, he had given her something she thought she'd never find again, safety. The bounty hunter's retreat left behind more than silence. It left behind a crossroads. For the first time since running, the girl realized she had a choice. She was no longer a prize to be claimed, no longer a body to be bought for $5, or bargained over like cattle. She had been defended, not as property, but as a person. Now she needed to decide what she would do with that freedom. The days after the standoff felt strange. The air was lighter, the horizon wider, Yet her thoughts churned heavier than ever. She found herself rising early before the cowboy stirred and walking to the edge of the pasture. There she would stand, gazing out over the open land, wondering what future might lie beyond those endless stretches of earth. Part of her longed to run again, to slip away at night, vanish into the unknown, and keep moving until no one could ever find her. The instinct to flee was etched deep into her bones, the reflex of someone who had survived by staying 2 steps ahead of danger. But another part of her, quieter, steadier, whispered that maybe running wasn't living at all. It was during one of those dawn walks that the cowboy found her. His boots crunched softly against the grass, his presence quiet as always. He didn't speak at first, simply stood beside her, looking out at the same horizon. She wondered if he knew how tangled her thoughts had become, if he could sense her restlessness the way he seemed to sense everything else. At last, she broke the silence. "I don't know what comes next." Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "All my life I've been running. From him, from the fear, from everything. And now, I don't know if I should keep running or if I can stay." The cowboy didn't answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on the land ahead, his profile calm beneath the morning light. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "No one can tell you your road, only you." The girl swallowed hard, blinking against a sudden sting in her eyes. She had wanted him to tell her what to do, to hand her the answer the way he had handed her safety. But instead, he was giving her something else. Responsibility. Choice. The very thing she'd been denied for so long. That day, she worked harder than usual, throwing herself into chores with a determined energy. She mended fence posts, helped carry water, even brushed down the horse with careful strokes. The cowboy didn't comment, didn't praise or correct her. He let her work, let her pour her restless thoughts into the rhythm of labor. And with every task she completed, she felt a small piece of herself knitting together, something sturdy, something strong. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she finally spoke her decision aloud. The cowboy was whittling by the fire, the soft scrape of his knife against wood filling the quiet. She sat across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I don't want to keep running," she said, her voice firm despite the fear beneath it. "I don't know if I'm ready for everything out there, but I know I'm ready to stop being afraid of every shadow. I want to stay here with you." The cowboy's knife stilled. For a long moment, he studied her with those steady gray eyes as if weighing the truth in her words. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Then stay." Relief washed over her so strong it brought tears to her eyes. But they weren't tears of fear this time. They were tears of release, of finally claiming her own path, her own life. The choice didn't erase her past. It didn't magically heal the wounds carved by years of cruelty. But it gave her something more powerful, the right to decide her future. She wasn't a runaway girl anymore, wasn't a nameless face in an auction. She was a woman who had chosen to live, to stand, to build something new alongside the one man who had never asked her to be anything but herself. As the firelight flickered across his face, she realized the cowboy hadn't just given her back her dignity. He had given her back her will, and with that, she knew the road ahead, whatever storms it brought, was finally hers to walk. The air smelled of rain that morning, fresh and sharp, carrying with it the promise of change. Clouds gathered, low and heavy above the prairie. But the girl didn't feel the same fear storms once stirred in her. She stood on the porch of the small cabin, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the land stretch endlessly before her. For the first time in what felt like forever, the horizon didn't look like a threat. It looked like possibility. Behind her, the door creaked open. The cowboy stepped out, his movements as quiet and deliberate as ever. He carried 2 tin cups of coffee, steam rising into the cool air, and handed one to her without a word. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his, and found comfort in the silence that passed between them. The weeks since her decision to stay had settled into a rhythm. Work during the day, firelight, and quiet companionship at night. She had expected the weight of the past to press harder against her, but instead, with each sunrise, it seemed to fade further away. The land became hers in small ways. The fence she had helped mend, the horse she could now ride without fear, the bread she baked that actually rose instead of collapsing flat. But more than the land, it was the cowboy's steady presence that gave shape to her new life. He didn't fill the air with promises he couldn't keep. He didn't bind her with expectations. He simply lived alongside her, offering strength when she faltered and space when she needed it. And that, she realized, was what true freedom felt like. Being seen, being allowed to exist without condition. Still, doubts lingered at the edges of her thoughts. Could something this fragile last? Would the bounty hunter return after all? Or worse, would her stepfather come himself? The scars of her past ran deep, and sometimes in the dark she still woke gasping. Certain rough hands were reaching for her. But each time she found herself safe in that quiet cabin, the cowboy's calm breathing steady in the next room, anchoring her to the present. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she finally gave voice to the question that had haunted her. "What if they come back?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the flames. The cowboy's knife paused mid-whittle. He didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "Then we'll face it." The simplicity of his answer struck her more deeply than any elaborate reassurance could have. He didn't promise her the world would be kind. He didn't pretend danger had vanished. He only promised he would stand with her when it came, and for her, that was enough. The storm broke the next morning. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled across the sky, and the earth drank deeply of the long-awaited water. She and the cowboy worked side by side, pulling in firewood, securing the horse, making sure the cabin was tight against the wind. They didn't speak much, but their movements matched as though they had been partners for years rather than weeks. By the time the storm passed, the world smelled washed clean. The grass glistened, the creek swelled, and the air felt new. The girl stepped outside, lifting her face to the sunlight breaking through the clouds. For the first time, she wasn't bracing against what might come. She was ready to meet it. She turned to the cowboy who leaned against the porch post, hat low over his eyes, arms folded across his chest. He looked the same as always, silent, steady, a figure carved from stone and shadow. Yet she realized he had changed her entire world without ever asking for anything in return. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried on the breeze. His gray eyes met hers, softening at the edges. He gave the barest nod, as though he didn't need words to understand. And in that quiet exchange, she knew her life had begun again. She was no longer a runaway girl worth only $5. She was no longer a name on an auction block or a shadow in someone else's story. She was free. She was home.